Hi, hello everybody. It's really nice to be here, although it's a pity that we don't get to meet each other in person. Feels a bit weird to be sitting in my desk and talking to you like this. But anyway, really cool to be able to share with you the work that I'm doing within the Nordic People and Plants research project on tracing Viking ethnobotany. I hope you enjoy it. Just a couple of words about myself and why am I talking to you in this course on ethnobotany. Tinde was really kind to invite me. Um, I did my PhD in ethnobotany at a university in the UK a couple of years back, but my research focused on changes in traditional herbal medicine in Morocco. So I spent quite some time in the Moroccan mountains collecting plants and doing interviews, talking to people. I stayed in Morocco after my PhD, working for the Global Diversity Foundation as a research consultant, and I helped them with various aspects of data collection and analysis for some of their projects on biocultural approaches to conservation in the High Atlas, in the same area where I was doing my research. And after that, I moved to Norway for personal reasons, but I ended up creating a project with a couple of researchers there called Nordic People and Plants, Rediscovering and Safeguarding Nordic Ethnobotanical Heritage. We wrote this project together, merging our interests, and we were lucky enough to get funded. I just put a couple of links here. I'm not sure if you will have access to the slides directly, but just if you want to read a bit more about what I do or what I've published, you can search me at the Natural History Museum in Oslo or in Google Scholar. So the Nordic People and Plants project is based at the Natural History Museum of the University of Oslo in Norway, but also in the Museum of Cultural History. And you will see that that's because we use very much an interdisciplinary approach to research. It started at the end of 2018 and it will run at least until 2021. So we're sort of midterm for the project. I work very closely with Annelin Kohl, a botanist and ethnobotanist, and Caroline Kjesterud, who's a historian, cultural and art historian, but also a philologist. For those of you who don't know, philologists are people who study texts in their original language and format, so usually historical texts, yeah, just manuscripts, handwritten. She is a specialist in runes and runology, so she can read the very few written sources that we have from the Viking Age, and that's really cool. The project was funded by the Norwegian Research Council and is based at University of Oslo. But we also work with many other academic institutions that provide complementary expertise that we don't have ourselves. And we also have an aspect of the work which is very much participatory science with the Norwegian Foraging Association and restaurants of the New Nordic Cuisine movement, people who are engaged with using Nordic plants at present. And we combine these different academic and non-academic approaches to learn about plant traditions in the Nordic areas in a nutshell. The project started somehow many years before we started writing about it, when Annelin put together an exhibition, a live exhibition at the Botanic Garden called the Viking Garden, as you can see here in the picture, which communicates to the public about the plants that the Vikings used. For example, the plants that they cultivated. There's quite some evidence for that, but also other plants that have been associated with the Viking Age. You see an example here of Cannabis sativa, macrofossil sample that is kept at the Museum of Cultural History. And the whole exhibition was set up using archaeobotanical data. So in archaeology, archaeologists sometimes find remains of plants in particular contexts that may indicate that some plants were grown or used in various ways, and that kind of information is the data that informed this exhibition. But of course, it's kind of information that leaves lots of questions open, because you may find a diversity of seeds in excavations that you don't really know if they were, just randomly there because the plants were growing in the area, or they were brought into a home for like food purposes or medicinal purposes. That's not something that you can tell from excavations, usually, or specifically for the Viking Age, right? Unless you find like later on plants in pharmaceutical cabinets, but that's another story. So lots of questions about plant use in the Viking Age open. Why is the Viking Age interesting? So the Nordic area, the Scandinavian countries, were covered in ice during the last glaciation, and then as the ice was retreating, people settled, people moved in. That's about 10,000 years ago, I think. So people were using and moving plants well back before the Viking Age. And just to give you an example, for example, there is very good documentation from Poland records that hazelnut hazel was brought to Scandinavia by people. So the first arrival of Poland, or the first evidence of Poland in Scandinavia, is very much associated with human settlements, a plant that now grows wild. What happened in the Viking Age is that suddenly there was a new technological development that allowed people in the Nordic areas to move through the sea. So basically, being able to build better boats that allowed longer distance travel, and that was combined with a slightly warmer climate, so a bit easier to travel across the North Sea, and possibly a surplus of population, accumulated wealth, that allowed to go Viking. And go Viking meant go trading and raiding. So not only raiding, but also trading. So suddenly, starting at the year 800 until the years 1100s, there was a lot of movement, diaspora from the Nordic areas around countries like around the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. So people, you can see here the usual routes for travel. So we go back to the original question: how, like, what plants did Vikings use, and how did they use them, right? To what extent, like, what is the extent of diversity that Vikings used? As I mentioned a bit earlier, there's very little written from the Viking Age. So we have very few runic inscriptions. Most of them have nothing to do. Well, all of them have nothing to do with plants. You'll see later there is a couple of exceptions, but there's writings on gravestones and such. What is written from or about the Viking Age comes much later, in the Middle Ages, when in Iceland the Nordic sagas were written down. But as I said, like, this is an oral tradition from the Viking Age that gets written down just much later. And in these sagas, which mostly have to do with like what kings did and which wars happened, and also have like a very important aspect of mythology, there's a few instances where there are references to plants and their uses. So, for example, here you have a little image of from that represents a scene from St. Olaf's saga where a warrior has like an open wound in his chest, and the story goes that he's given some onion soup, because if you can smell the onion soup from the wound, it means that the wound is so bad that the person's not going to survive. So you better go and treat someone else. but these instances where you say, okay, onion soup was used as a diagnose tool, are extremely rare. So what do we plan to do? In the Nordic People and Plants, the whole idea is that by combining methods and data from very different disciplines in the humanities and the natural sciences, we can have a bigger picture. We can triangulate these different kinds of evidence to go a bit further. So with archaeobotanical remains, we can say, okay, there is this plant diversity, but we cannot say how it was used. There's a few instances in the saga where there's mentions of how these plants were used. And then, of course, we have the ethnobotanical or the tradition on plants in the Nordic countries that we can look at as well. So how have been plants used traditionally across these areas? And of course, this is data that comes from much later. And what I'm going to do now is show you a couple of examples of each kind of information and how we plan to use it. And later I will move forward to tell you a bit about some results. So archaeobotanical data, this is how archaeobotanical data looks like. There's these reports that state the different samples that have been found in different places. Stolpehul means pit, if I'm not mistaken. And then there can be like some grains of cereal, corn in Norwegian means cereal in general. You can see some hazelnut, etc. So we have these lists of plant parts here and there. And by looking at where exactly in an excavation the plant is found, so if it's next to like a cooking pit, for example, it can indicate perhaps food use. But what's interesting is that archaeobotanical data is very rarely studied comparatively, so looking at different excavations and how sets of plants appear in different parts of the different excavations. So usually archaeologists work within one single site, and here we're trying to see if there are any patterns of distributions that are general and would spread among Viking Age archaeological sites. As I mentioned, there are some runic inscriptions, probably like 2 or 3 that have mentions of plants, so very, very, very rare. One very interesting one is this Linna Laukar Alu, which is repeated in different kinds of artifacts found across the Nordic region. And Linna means flax, linum, Laukar means garlic, leek, onion, so a plant of the allium species. And then alu means ale, and Caroline has interpreted this inscription as some kind of protective formula that would have like health implications, and that was linked to very important rituals around ale and drinking ale at the time. There's of course a lot to read about it. Like, this is just a very short explanation. She will be publishing a paper on this very soon if you're interested. We can also see plants from evidence from the Viking Age itself in iconographic sources. This has never been looked at because these decorations from the Viking Age show some animals like snakes and dragons, horses, and there's much written about them, but no one has actually checked if any of these decorations could represent plants, and that's something that we haven't started yet, but we will also do. Later on, towards like the end of the Viking Age, the beginning of the Middle Ages, we start having these staff churches, wooden churches in the Nordic region, especially in Norway, and they do have very clear plant decorations. And here's an example of a portal, an entrance of a church with these vines that had always been interpreted as wine because of the very important role of wine within the Christian church. But wine doesn't grow in Norway, So the person who built this church may have never seen wine, and then wine was not part of the local culture at the time, when ale had a very, very, very important role. To the point that the Archbishop of the Faroe Islands at some point wrote a letter to the Pope saying, please, can we just use ale during Mass, because we don't have wine and it's very expensive to import it, and we have ale, and use that. And the Pope said, definitely no, you still have to get the wine from Southern Europe. But it opens questions about this role of ale, and then the role of plants that were used to brewing ale. For example, hops. So hops is one of the plants that has been used for brewing beer, and that is the plant that is still added to all the beers that we drink. And if you look at hops, it's strikingly similar to wine, in the sense that it's also a vine. The leaves have almost the same shape. And then when you look at the inflorescences which are used for beer brewing, they could very well be these depictions in the wooden portal, right? So question open. Maybe we'll be able to answer it. Another kind of evidence that we use is historical literature. Again, there's no texts, books from the Viking Age, but towards the beginning of the Middle Ages, we have the first herbal, which is written in Old Norse. And this is something I forgot to say at the beginning, but Vikings, so the populations of the Nordic region at the Viking Age spoke Old Norse, a shared language. And these herbals were usually written in Latin, and here we have one of the first examples of a herbal translated to the vernacular, the local language. This herbal has been consulted by many people, and there's notes about the information it has here and there, but it has never been translated as a whole. And there has never been like a thorough botanical identification of the plants it refers to, and this is something we plan to do in this project a bit later on. We have literature from the medieval ages, until present day, and there is especially a couple of really interesting sources that we will look at. One is this one, Flora Norvegica, that is a key document because for the first time in the 18th century, Bishop Gunnerus links botanical knowledge with plant specimens. So in the 18th century, we have the first evidence of what vernacular names we're referring to. When we think about floras nowadays, we just think about this systematic classification of the botanical diversity, but back in the day, floras were also economic botany pursuits. So it was not just about describing the diversity that existed in a place, but also documenting its economic potential. So what was the traditional knowledge that could potentially be used at a larger scale? And that's what Flora Norvegica does. So it lists plants, as you can see here, in a usual fashion of a flora, with like numbers and the Latin names, vernacular names, but then also it would mention this was used for this purpose by the Sami people, or this was used for that purpose by local farmers here and there. So this is really a key piece that we have worked on. I'll present some results later. And then we have ethnobotanical sources, like more modern, from the 20th century. And these are books written at a time when there was starting to be an awareness that lifestyles were changing very quickly, modernization was happening, industrialization was happening, and people were dropping their traditional lifestyles to adopt more modern lifestyles. And for example, in the case of Norway, there was Ove Arve Hoeg, a botanist, who documented traditional knowledge from Norway with this idea of like documenting it before it dies out. And the book is really thorough with a lot of information specifying where it is from, etc., with vernacular names, the different kinds of uses, who used it, how it was used, etc. So what we would know as an ethnobotanical survey nowadays. Because we have this kind of books from across the Nordic region, so from Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Faroe Islands, and Iceland, we can try to do some out-of-the-box research. So let's pause here for a second. You all know about biological evolution and the representation of species relationships in trees, this kind of trees. You can also represent the relationships between languages in these kind of trees. So of course you don't use DNA to build these relationships. What you use is similarities between the words in one language or another. So words can have an ancestral origin of many languages, or can be specific of one language, and this kind of information is used to build these trees. So here we have the tree of the Indo-European language family, where you can see in blue the Middle Low Germanic clade, and then in gray the North Germanic clade, in green the Romanic languages, etc. So basically these representations allow us to study the evolution of language and the evolution of culture in a similar way that we study the evolution of species. I said before that the Vikings spoke Old Norse, and so Old Norse is the ancestral language at the base, at the node at the base of the clade of the North Germanic languages here in gray. With that, what we can do is infer ancestral traits for traits that are present in modern languages. So if we think of plant X used in way Y, is it present or absent in the different North Germanic languages? We can infer if this trait was present or absent at the node. And I'll show you an example of this later. We wrote a paper about this with my supervisor, PhD supervisor, and an evolutionary anthropologist a couple of years ago, where we proposed this idea, and now with this project we are testing it. This can be called virtual archaeology or digital humanities. And then finally, we also do some ethnobotanical surveys and collect some ethnographic data, and do some experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeology means to try to reproduce ancient techniques or processes. And so we do that when we find some interesting way of using a particular plant. We have people like Gaute Windek, who's a forager and a cook, who would like try it out and see what happens. Does it taste good? How does it work out? And so we work with people from the Norwegian Mycology and Foraging Association that are really interested in these things, and it's a very fruitful collaboration that really goes both ways.